September 19th, 1944. Hurtgen Forest, near the German-Belgian border. The morning should have been quiet. Instead, the forest shook under the force of hundreds of artillery shells. Towering pine trees exploded into clouds of splintered wood, filling the air with razor-sharp fragments. Thick smoke rolled through the mist, and every blast sent the ground trembling beneath exhausted soldiers. Von der Gefreiter Karlbrenner, a 22-year-old German infantryman, this wasn't just another battlefield, it was a nightmare with no escape. He pressed himself into a muddy foxhole as another shell burst overhead. Unlike open battlefields, artillery inside the Hurtgen forest was far deadlier. When shells struck the trees, the trunks shattered into thousands of wooden shards that sliced through helmets, uniforms, and flesh. Many soldiers never saw the shell that killed them. The trees did the work instead. Karl gripped his carabiner 98K tightly. His hands were cold, wet, and shaking, not from the weather alone, but from the knowledge that an American assault could begin at any moment. The Hurtgen forest stretched for miles across steep hills and dense woodland. Visibility was often less than 30 meters. Every fallen log could hide a sniper. Every narrow trail might be covered by a machine gun. Even experienced officers struggled to navigate the maze of trees. When the artillery finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the forest. No birds sang. No wind moved the branches. Only the distant cries of wounded men echoed through the smoke. Then, from somewhere ahead, came the unmistakable sound of boots crushing wet leaves. The Americans were coming. Karl slowly raised his rifle. Around him, the remaining soldiers did the same. Weeks of fighting had already reduced their company to barely half its original strength, yet retreat was not an option. Behind them lay Germany itself, and every meter of forest had been ordered held at all costs. What neither side fully understood was that this forest would become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most psychologically devastating battles fought on the Western Front. And for the men trapped inside it, survival would depend as much on luck as on courage. As the first American soldiers emerged through the fog, Karl could barely make out their silhouettes between the shattered trees. "Wait," his squad leader whispered. The German soldiers held their fire. The enemy moved cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and shell craters. They knew the forest was filled with hidden machine gun nests, tripwires, and mines. Every step could be their last. Then suddenly, an MG-42 machine gun erupted from the German line. Its terrifying rate of fire shattered the silence, cutting through the forest like a giant saw. American soldiers dove behind trees as rifle fire echoed in every direction. Within seconds, the forest became chaos. Karl fired his carabiner 98K at a figure disappearing behind a pine tree. Before he could chamber another round, American artillery answered. The first shell landed 50 meters away. The second landed much closer. Then dozens more crashed into the forest. Unlike battles fought across open fields, there was almost nowhere to hide. Every exploding shell ripped apart the trees, turning heavy branches into deadly missiles. Veterans later said they feared flying wood more than bullets. Karl threw himself flat as a massive pine tree cracked above him. The trunk collapsed across the trench, burying 2 German soldiers beneath it. Their cries lasted only a few seconds. When the barrage finally lifted, the battlefield had completely changed. Trails had disappeared. Foxholes had collapsed. Entire sections of forest had been flattened. The surviving Germans looked around in disbelief. Men they had spoken with only minutes earlier were simply gone. But there was no time to mourn. American infantry pushed forward once again. The fighting became incredibly close. Soldiers fired at shadows only 20 or 30 meters away. Thick smoke and fog made it almost impossible to identify friend from foe. Patrols sometimes stumbled into each other by accident before either side realized what had happened. Even experienced officers admitted they had lost all sense of direction. The Hurtgen forest had become more than a battlefield. It had become a trap. Every day, fresh reinforcements entered the woods, believing they were joining another operation on the Western Front. Within hours, they understood why veterans spoke about this place in hushed voices. Because once the forest swallowed you, there was no guarantee it would ever let you leave. Days turned into weeks. The battle showed no sign of ending. Cold autumn rain transformed every trench into a pit of thick mud. Blankets stayed soaked. Boots never dried. Food arrived late, if it arrived at all. Ammunition had to be carried by hand through narrow forest trails, constantly targeted by artillery and snipers. For Karl Brenner, the enemy was no longer just the Americans. It was the forest itself. Every snapping branch sounded like an approaching patrol. Every gust of wind made soldiers reach for their rifles. Sleep became almost impossible. Men grabbed only a few minutes of rest. Before another artillery barrage or mortar attack forced them back into the mud. Then winter arrived. The first snow covered the shattered landscape, hiding thousands of mines beneath a blanket of white. Soldiers on both sides stepped carefully, knowing one wrong move could end their lives instantly. One freezing morning, Karl's platoon was ordered to hold a narrow ridge overlooking a forest road. Intelligence suggested American engineers were preparing a path for tanks. The Germans waited in complete silence. Minutes later, movement appeared through the trees. American infantry. Behind them came engineers carrying explosives to clear obstacles. Karl tightened his grip on his rifle. "Hold your fire," the sergeant whispered. The Americans moved closer. 30 meters, 20, 15. Now! The German line erupted. MG-42 machine guns filled the forest with an overwhelming roar, while rifle fire echoed from every direction. American soldiers dived behind fallen trees, returning fire almost immediately. Grenades exploded. Mortars crashed into the ridge. Snow, dirt, and splintered wood filled the air. The battle lasted less than half an hour, but when it ended, neither side had gained more than a few dozen meters. The cost, however, was enormous. Karl looked around. Half of the new replacements, who had arrived only days earlier, were either dead or badly wounded. One young soldier sat against a tree, completely unharmed, but he couldn't stop shaking. He stared into the distance, unable to speak. Doctors at the time called it battle exhaustion. Today, many would recognize it as severe combat trauma. Years later, German veterans admitted that the Hurtgen Forest didn't just wound their bodies. It changed their minds forever. Some never forgot the endless shelling. Others said they could still hear exploding trees decades after the war had ended. And the worst was still to come. November 16, 1944, before dawn, Karl Brenner woke to a deep rumble rolling through the forest. At first, he thought it was thunder. Then the sky erupted. Hundreds of American artillery guns opened fire almost simultaneously. Thousands of shells screamed over the treetops, turning the Hurtgen Forest into an ocean of explosions. The earth shook so violently that soldiers struggled to stay on their feet. Veterans would later describe it as one of the heaviest bombardments they had ever experienced. Karl threw himself into his foxhole just as a shell exploded overhead. The blast shattered another pine tree. Its trunk split apart, sending razor-sharp wooden splinters through the air. One struck a soldier several meters away. Another pierced a helmet as if it were made of paper. When the barrage finally ended, nothing looked familiar. The trench line had disappeared. Trees that had stood for decades now lay scattered across the ground. Smoke covered everything. Then came another sound. Engines. American tanks. Although the dense forest made armored attacks difficult, American engineers had spent weeks clearing narrow paths through the woods. Now tanks rolled forward, supported by fresh infantry determined to break the German defenses once and for all. Karl's platoon rushed to their positions. A German anti-tank team waited silently beside the trail, clutching a Panzerfaust. The lead American tank slowly emerged through the smoke. 20 meters. 15. 10. The German gunner fired. The rocket slammed into the tank's front armor. Flames burst from the vehicle as its crew scrambled to escape. The burning wreck blocked the narrow forest road, forcing the tanks behind it to stop. Immediately, both sides opened fire. Machine guns rattled. Rifles cracked through the trees. Mortars exploded among the shattered pines. For hours, neither army gained more than a few hundred meters. Every hill, every trench, and every fallen tree had to be fought over again and again. By sunset, Karl's company had been reduced to barely a handful of men. No one talked about victory anymore. The only goal was surviving until morning, and even that was never guaranteed. For German veterans, this was the true horror of Hurtgen. Not one decisive battle, not one terrifying day, but months of relentless fear, where every sunrise meant another march into a forest that seemed determined to kill everyone inside it. By December 1944, snow covered what remained of the Hurtgen Forest. The battlefield was almost unrecognizable. Entire hillsides had been stripped bare by artillery. Burned-out tanks rested beside shattered trees. Shell craters filled with ice and dirty water stretched in every direction. Thousands of German and American soldiers had fought and died for ground that neither side would remember as a true victory. Karl Brenner stood quietly, beside the ruins of what had once been his company's defensive line. When he had entered the forest months earlier, nearly 50 men had marched beside him. Now fewer than a dozen remained. Some had been killed by bullets, others by artillery. Many never received a proper grave. The forest had simply swallowed them. As the battle gradually shifted toward the Ardennes, and the fighting moved elsewhere, Karl finally left the Hurtgen Forest. But the forest never truly left him. Years after the war, veterans gathered to speak about the campaigns they had survived. They talked about France, Italy, Normandy, and the Eastern Front. Yet whenever Hurtgen was mentioned, the room usually fell silent. Many admitted they still dreamed about the exploding trees. Others said the sound of thunder instantly brought them back to those endless artillery barrages. Some refused to walk through forests for the rest of their lives, not because they feared nature, but because the smell of wet pine, damp earth, and cold rain awakened memories they had spent decades trying to bury. Historians estimate that the Battle of Hurtgen Forest lasted nearly 5 months and became one of the longest and most costly battles fought on the Western Front. Tens of thousands of American and German soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or went missing. Yet despite the enormous sacrifice, the strategic gains remained limited. For the men who fought there, statistics meant very little. They remembered something far more personal: the freezing nights, the endless mud, the shattered trees, the friends who answered roll call one morning and were gone by the next. That is why so many German veterans spoke of Hurtgen with such horror. It wasn't simply another battle. It was a place where courage, training, and experience often meant less than luck. A place where the forest itself seemed to become another enemy. And for those fortunate enough to survive, some battles ended when the guns fell silent. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest did not. It echoed in memories for the rest of their lives. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.